All right. Well, greetings and welcome, everyone. My name is Tina Mufford. I'm with the Department of State's Office of International Religious Freedom. Thank you so much for joining us. This week, we mark two occasions, Human Rights Day and the conclusion to 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, both of which occur this Thursday, December 10th. It is in this spirit that we bring you today's event, Trafficking of Women and Girls in China via Forced and Fraudulent Marriage. Now, before we begin, I need to make one technical announcement. We are pleased to offer today's event in live interpretation in both English and Urdu. Everyone must select a language. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see an interpretation icon. It's a globe. You'll need to click the icon and select either English or Urdu. Now, for example, English speakers, you must select English in order to ensure that you hear the interpretation later in our program. And now, to formally open our event, I am privileged to turn things over to the U.S. Department of State's Ambassador at Large to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, John C. Richmond. Prior to his current role, Ambassador Richmond had a distinguished career in the global battle for freedom. He co-founded the Human Trafficking Institute that exists to decimate modern slavery at its source, and his work to combat human trafficking has earned numerous honors. Mr. Ambassador, you are a true champion combating trafficking in persons. Ambassador Richmond, I turn it over to you.
Tina, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be able to be here to join Ambassador Curry and Ambassador Brownback and esteemed members of the Academy, including Professor Leary, whom I respect so greatly, and members of civil society to address this unique form of human trafficking. You know, we're here to discuss how human traffickers exploit people all over the world in forced and fraudulent marriage in China. And experts tell us that China's former one-child policy and other state-sanctioned population control policies have created a legacy of gender imbalance that drives the demand for brokered marriages between Chinese men and women from around the world. Now, as we note in the Trafficking in Persons report that comes out every year in June, every year deceptive and coercive brokers transport thousands of women and girls and men from Southeast Asia, Africa, all the way to China, where traffickers subject them to sex trafficking, sexual assault, forced childbearing, and forced labor in domestic service under false pretenses of marriage to local men. Chinese men often take out large loans to pay these predatory marriage brokers. A portion of the money is often used to create false travel and identity documents, so some girls under the age of 18 are able to pass through immigration services undetected. The brokers, sometimes with local accomplices and sometimes in person, actually deceive women with promises of happy financial security. More deceptive brokers lure with job offers in China, only to turn them over to husbands once they're across the border. To recover the debt, these quote husbands sometimes subject women to forced prostitution, to domestic servitude, and sometimes impregnating them and forcing them to bear children, even transferring them to a new husband in exchange for money. Many of these victims are actually trafficked twice, first by the broker and later by the husband. What makes this trend even more tragic is the apathy of some law enforcement authorities when survivors of these horrors escape and attempt to report their abuses. For instance, we once met a brave woman from an ethnic minority in Burma. A trafficker operating as a broker deceived her with a job offer in China. She traveled there only for a Chinese family to confine her for over a year and force her to bear a child. When she finally escaped, she ran to the closest police station and they returned her to her traffickers and her husband. And the abuse continued for months until she finally fled again. She was able to cross back into Burma, but Chinese authorities refused to help her relocate and reunite with her son. Some local law enforcement officers have helped these women by giving them money for transportation or temporary shelter. But these ad hoc, at best, services, they do nothing to hold the perpetrators accountable. Traffickers are operating with near impunity. The truth is that authorities in China often side with the traffickers or the husbands, preventing the women from accessing justice, protection services, or compensation. Rather than arresting the traffickers, some police actually arrest the victims as they flee and force them to return to their traffickers, sometimes in exchange for bribes to the man's family. You know, this story isn't unique. It happens so commonly that many countries mistakenly believe that it's the only form of trafficking that exists. And there's an unfortunate domino effect here. That is, many countries put all their effort into stopping this form of trafficking and fail to address all the other types of trafficking in their own countries. But some countries are getting on track. They're building systems and processes to strengthen the preventative efforts against this form of trafficking. Governments must avoid overly restrictive policies and preventative measures. We want to stop this form of trafficking, but we do not want to put additional controls that harm people.
Thank you.
Indeed, governments must train their immigration officials to identify forced or fraudulent marriages before they happen. And this involves knowing the trends, learning from survivor experiences, being able to spot signs of deception, and catching falsified identity documents. It also involves training officials to connect with law enforcement and protective networks, government bodies providing social services, NGOs, people who provide psychosocial care, so the traffickers are brought to justice and victims are made whole. Countries should also be ready to investigate, prosecute, convict, and sentence local accomplices who facilitate these crimes, and they should raise awareness of fraudulent recruitment in schools. We know that brokers prey on vulnerable communities. This includes internally displaced ethnic and religious minority groups and communities hit hard by conflict and natural disasters. And as now we are learning, also public health crises. So government should work harder to protect the human rights of these vulnerable communities so that it can lessen the push factors that cause them to seek opportunities in China. But before I conclude, I want to acknowledge the challenges that some countries face when trying to work with China on this issue. We know the audience isn't always receptive, but I urge governments to continue to press China to do more, to identify, to protect, assist, and certainly not participate in this horrible crime. We want them to ensure the rights of parents are protected. We want them to punish the perpetrators. We want them to work hard to prevent it from happening in the first place, including by demand-targeted awareness raising and enforcement. And we will continue to do this in our reporting and our engagement on the world stage. I'm so grateful for all of you convening this important discussion, and I look forward to hearing from survivors, look forward to learning about your experiences and all the ideas that are going to be shared. Together, we are in this fight to win. We want to make sure that the cause of freedom is paramount, that we put freedom first, and that this form of trafficking, and quite frankly, every form of trafficking, is absolutely decimated, and that everyone is free to select where they live, where they work, and who touches their bodies. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ambassador Richmond. Those were powerful remarks, and we're grateful that you kicked off our event with such strong statements. As you mentioned, these are challenging topics to address, and for the victims, it's challenging to talk about. And that's why now we're going to transfer over to our survivor testimony portion of the program. Now, our first survivor testimony today comes from a woman in Vietnam. Her testimony will be read by Luong Ly. She's the anti-trafficking coordinator with Blue Dragon Children's Foundation, which is a Vietnam-based NGO assisting children and families. Our second survivor testimony comes to us from the Kachin Women's Association Thailand, which is an NGO based in Chiang Mai, Thailand, that works to protect and empower Kachin women and children from neighboring Burma. Luong, thank you for offering to assist with the testimony. We look forward to the comments you'll share. Over to you.
Thank you, Tina. So my name is Luong. I am now reading the testimony from Nguyen, one of our survivors. My name is Nguyen. I am 20 years old from far southern Vietnam. My mother was a single mom. I never knew my father. When I was 10, my mother left me with my grandparents, and I never saw or heard anything about her again. My grandparents worked as street vendors selling food in order to have enough money to raise me. But money was always short. And at 11, I dropped out of school to work to support my grandparents. The year I turned 17, I was working at a coffee shop about 10 kilometers from my home. That's when I was tricked to marry a Chinese man. I went home to visit my family. A distant relative came and asked me if I wanted a job with a high salary. I accepted the offer and followed the relative. As soon as I crossed the border into China, I was told that there was no job, and I was forced to marry a Chinese man. Otherwise, I would have to pay back the cost of the trip. I was sold to a man who was extremely poor and could only afford a ride kanji. I tried to get internet to calls for help. I successfully contacted the relative, and she rescued me from the first marriage. But I then found out that she immediately sold me to another man. I found a way to escape again. Brutally, I was sold a third time to another man in different provinces of China. My third husband and his parents were all suffering from mental illness. They locked me in the house and helped their son to rape me. I was desperate, and I jumped out of the window from the second floor and knocked myself out. When I woke up, I could not feel anything in my legs. The husband's family found me and took me back inside and kept me there for months, ignoring me cries of pain. The husband continued to rape me, even though I was severely injured. During that time, I could not move or go to the toilet. My abdomen started to swell, making them think that I was pregnant. They brought me to a local hospital for examination. They took me home right away when they knew I was not pregnant. But my condition got much worse, and the family had to take me to the hospital again. Knowing that it was my last chance to get them rescued, I screamed and cried out hysterically for someone to help me. The Chinese doctor became very suspicious and called the police. Once they knew I was Vietnamese, the police required the hospital to keep me so they could investigate my case. The doctor told me I had a spinal cord injury and needed surgery. After the operation, although it was successful, the doctors advised me that I needed long-term physical therapy. The police and hospital arranged me to stay in a small vacant room at the hospital to get medical care and participate in the criminal investigation process. During my time in the hospital, I, on the wheelchair, had to take care of myself. I spent almost a year at the hospital to complete the investigation before being repatriated to Vietnam. I was relieved to know that as a result of this investigation, the Chinese husband and his father were each sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for human trafficking and sexual violation. The Vietnamese police contacted Blue Dragon to help repatriate me and provide reintegration support. Blue Dragon collected me at the border and brought me back to Hanoi. A social worker took me to a hospital in Hanoi. I still strongly believed that my legs would recover. Unfortunately, the doctor reported there was no chance I would ever be able to walk again. This broke my spirit. I could not accept the fact that I was disabled for life. My future was so uncertain. My grandparents were too old to take care of me. Blue Dragon invited me to stay in their shelter for survivors of trafficking and supported my daily living and medical needs. They also supported me to attend some therapy to improve the functional performance of my legs and strengthen other parts of my body so I could manage my disability. Blue Dragon psychologists provided intensive therapy to help me come to terms with my situation and recover from the trauma of my abuse in China. I blamed myself for my experiences. I shouldn't have trusted my relative that easily. I was so naive. I also should not have jumped from the second floor. I would have stayed with the Chinese family if they did not hit me or he did not abuse me that much. After 5 months, I felt more confident. I registered for a graphic design training course. I completed the training course in August 2020, and I have already had a job at the photo design center upon graduation. The Vietnamese police carried out the investigation of my case. However, knowing that I had returned, the relative ran away to avoid prosecution. I am now participating in different activities to support people with disability, abused children, and survivors of human trafficking. I am positive about making my life meaningful to society. Yeah, that's her testimony.
Huang, thank you so much for sharing Nian's story with us. It's, I think, a stark reminder that trafficking itself is sometimes only the catalyst to many other abuses that follow, and the physical and psychological trauma that these individuals face for the rest of their lives. So thank you again for sharing. We'll now transfer to our next survivor testimony. It is a documentary video. And just as a word of advice, the first few moments of the video, there is no sound. It's all text, so you'll just read the text until the sound kicks in. So pause for one moment as I key up the video.
난도 차고도 때고 심가닝 시쿠닝 드럼 거라
Bona sabi kumela yang ashe si jote ta phani kam lo si jote yang nasi nasetit nasenit the da si jote cha ta thiang kai lo ya lom long la ya the khane khumani nga yang ma da zon sak ni kam lo kai sakba se da phani ong nga le tim te le mi ram do ka na traffic kumela ta ke kon bu de tao yak kha ke ni ga na tao yak kha ke re na se ngao ngao ni nga yang go tam sha kai lo ai ngui tam em sha ma nga na se ne gao du cha khum mai nga go mu wa mu ha bo nai de yun nan na ora gao san ma den thi ni ba no passbook ni ba mai lang ma se de sha tan ni sha de ga du cha lom lo pe phan de ga khu
thế na mình đang có mò mua sả gạo ở đây sao mò mua để xí cái nào xong rồi mò mua con ngải đó mò mua con ngải xí nu ni thế身体có sả đây ấy đó thế có một nghệ sinh viên ấy mà ta đây giặc cái một nghệ cho nghệ sinh viên nó sả ná một phần coi tôi 진짜 거 đi mua ngay để có xong à 더 나한테 영아 대 방에 정말 신dio 아상 심은 낭이남 낭심망가 나갔습니다. 너 레사망구나 리에 레사망구나 신데 대 인장 거도 싫어 그대고 상하시 그대고 미디야 더 워킹아 대고고 니나 만나나 신우니세 더나 마산이야 세상아 삼아 영어 대어 신남 대이 만나나 그누니세 신남 낭이야 대 호텔고 사사래 땡신데 바 그러면 언제 대구 상하시 방에 ngày phải gọi tới ship nuna mình làm nữa tao có bé bằng coi tao bé áp coi tao nó sẽ sinh theo qua mặt nhưng nào mà qua mặt ra mà mình ngay chưa mua là ngay xin nào tao có bé bằng tất cả 근데 봐서는 이제 뭐가 대수면 들이 뭐가 왠지 시 가고 했네 그러고 그러려면 이제 또 그냥 뭐 스타콩 대 무한다 두거나 좀 이야 그러고 이제 그러면서라 되거나 어시 되고래 내고 이야 또 차야 되버리 제 맞들라 그러니까 혼자 와 마서
bai chinaya se chinaya ti mu ka ko ni yang ayang de mu su ya ni ayang chen na mu mu sha ni mu kum pro the jo nam ri da rem jo i ka ngai sha ban chinga ya de son ni ri yang bai sa wei la na she ha bong nai blik tap de wa shop i an the na TTF ni blik tap de wa jo ta se nga ti mu chen ni bai de nu mo phong sang wa se nga tin bai sa wei lam de mi chi be tu cha da i de ta de ha bai wa sa gao de zon ni jak ni ma nga
마음 runnim cho lại 마음 runnim cho quân mát rồi àแต่เชื่อมาคุณก็เชื่อลงคุมติงมาปุ๊บมาละปุ๊บมาแต่นะฮะใส่คุณดีรองไอ้งามจ้ะเดี๋ยวพอมีไงอ่ะฉันเด็กก็ได้เนื้อชีพอเจ้าเต็นตอนนั้นเรียบมาแต่เต็นตอนนั้นเรียบมานะฮะ대야 이제 시안 누래 대대 삼아다 시안 누래 삼아나 대대 도용가 된 거 이제 사요 뭐 앞편안에 배 섞어 뭐 앞편안에 배 섞어 되거나 대시안 나 초콜릿 그거 스타콩 왕아가 되거나 뭐 되거나 편안에 돼 để na ni thế bây một chút một cái na chân đẹp của đàn bây qua ta đây film có
là trafficking khum na waiแต่ส่วนในฟ้าอันที่นี่ก็ช่องฉันเนี่ยดูว่าที่อันที่เดียวอันที่น่าสิพอเวงานะฉันจะแต่อันที่ต่างดีรามิซีรำนี้อันที่ก็รวยเลยนะเช่เพื่อลำพวกนั้นตาว่าลำจิกนี่กลุ่มใหญ่เลยรีพูดมาเลยอีฉันจะนำตัวกำพอบุญดีมามีชาบิลุมดีสตัวยังสตัวแต่นำตัวเลยรีพูดมานักรุมเลยแต่ลำกงง่ายก็แต่ว่าฉันจะนี่รายถ้าคันหน้าเลยอีฉันจะนี่พี่ชนเลยถ้าเสียงนั้นฉันจะไปฮับโบกลัวยังมิดล้อมไปทุกวันที่ชงสันล้านนะฮะฉันจะนี่ว่าเรียมยืงยังว่ามีรียายตุ่มซูยังมองตุ่มซูขั้นต่ำน้ำรียายอีเดซอนเนี่ยมาฉันจะกัดตุ่มยืงยังก็กัดเรนนี่เป็นที่มีรียายนะฉันจะไปตัดตุ่มกลัวชุนในงาน
I would like to thank again the Kachin Women's Association Thailand for that video. It was beautiful, beautifully shot, but just another harrowing story. We've now heard survivor testimony from a woman originally from Burma, a survivor story from a woman from Vietnam. And with that, we'd like to transition to our next stage of the program. As we transition, I'd like to remind anyone who perhaps joined us late or didn't do so at the beginning to please select a language for interpretation. You can do so by clicking on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. It should be a little globe. So for example, English speakers, you would need to select English, which will ensure that you can hear the English language interpretation of our Urdu speaker. And now, to kick off our panel and for a few remarks, I'd like to turn things over to Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, Ambassador Kelly E. Curry, to give remarks and to moderate our panel of experts. Now, I've known Ambassador Curry for several years and have been thrilled to see her leadership drive important issues at the State Department, where she has also had roles leading the Office of Global Criminal Justice and serving as the U.S. representative to the UN Economic and Social Council, and also as alternative representative to the UN General Assembly. Her career-long focus and expertise on human rights, political reform, development, and humanitarian issues, with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region, is truly inspiring. Ambassador Curry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina, for that very kind and overly generous introduction. I have to also thank Tina and Ambassador Richmond and the others responsible for this event today, my friend Ambassador Brownback, who, with the idea for doing this event among the three of us, this wouldn't have happened without the leadership that I have from colleagues and from great partners here at the State Department. As the Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, I am fortunate to be able to work with wonderful colleagues here at the State Department to highlight challenges such as the one that we're focusing on today, which is the trafficking of women and girls into China from surrounding countries. I want to thank everybody who's joining us today for this important discussion. This truly is one of the underreported issues that when we think about the challenge that we face and the results of Chinese Communist Party rule and the human rights abuses that flow from that, this is not always the top of mind, but it's an issue that affects nearly every country around China, and every country on its border suffers from the problems that are inherent inside China due to Chinese government policies and Chinese Communist Party determination to control everything, including the reproductive cycles of the people of China. It's also very fitting that this event coincides with 16 days of activism against violence against women this year. This is a campaign that we do every year here at the State Department, and my office is proud to lead. It starts on November 25th, which is the day of action, and then goes through Human Rights Day on December 10th. And this year, this event is part of our efforts to raise awareness and to work for the protection and the end of violence against women, including trafficking. The testimonies that we've heard today highlight what the pull factors are for this kind of trafficking, this bride trafficking into China, and this kidnapping and coercion of women into the sex trade, essentially through marriage. And it should really erase any question about why the United States is so committed to working on these issues and why we have taken such a strong stand on the issue of trafficking of women and girls and the need to support and assist them. It also highlights the important role that our civil society partners, such as Blue Dragon and the Kachin Women's Association, play in providing essential services and being able to reach these hidden victims of Chinese oppression in countries around the region. When we think about why this is happening, the locus has to come back to the history of China's one-child policy, which has created a dramatic and nearly unresolvable gender imbalance in the Chinese population. Because of a historical and cultural preference for male children, millions of girls were murdered as a result of the implementation of the one-child policy over the past 70 years. And the gender imbalance is conservatively estimated at more than 30 million missing girls who should have been born during that time period, but were not. And so this has fueled the demand for large-scale trafficking of women into China, whether it's for bride trafficking or for enslavement in the sex industry in China, which is enormous. Sadly, this problem seems to only be getting worse despite official pronouncements by the Chinese government since 2016 that they have ended the one-child policy because of the historic deficit and the imbalance, the gender imbalance across the population for the past 2 generations as a result of this preference, as a result of the forced abortion of children, the result of gendercide from the murder of female and the abandonment of female babies. This crisis will only get worse, we anticipate. With Burma, there's also the added element of how Chinese foreign policy creates conflict and repression in a neighboring country and shields that country's perpetrators from the consequences of their behavior. One of the main drivers, as Kewat mentioned, for girls to leave Kachin State and Shan State and the neighboring areas there is the conflict that has been taking place in Kachin State between local communities and the Burmese government. And since this conflict began to escalate again after the breaking of a ceasefire in 2011, the Chinese government has worked very hard in the international community to shield the Burmese military, which is its close partner, from the consequences of their repression and their abuse in Kachin State and Shan State. And this has created a permissive environment for a terrible trafficking problem. And the discussion that Kewat, that the video demonstrated, is just the tip of the iceberg. But it shows that this is not just a matter of China's internal policies affecting the Chinese people, but how Chinese foreign policy also creates drive and push factors for trafficking. We see this also we're seeing this also when we hear from families of women and girls who are trafficked into areas to provide as brides. And we see what happens when the Chinese media finds out about these cases, or even the failure to prosecute or take these matters seriously by the Chinese authorities. Recently, there was a very prominent case of 629 brides trafficked from Pakistan, where the trafficking ring was busted, and the authorities shut that down. But that did not really change the media narrative about what was happening and why. And despite the fact that the Chinese Communist Party crushes any dissent that it disapproves of, or any communication and and is able to censor the internet very effectively, they seem to be turning a blind eye to many practices and websites that facilitate trafficking, including online services such as Zhangyue, love.com, which offers a money-back guarantee if the brides that they traffic to men in China are not virgins, and free replacements if for brides to run away. This is just appalling that these things are allowed to happen. And so what concerns us the most is that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here, and when it comes to bride trafficking. According to the Chinese government's own estimates and own census reporting, from 1996 to 2000, the birth imbalance was 120 boys to every 100 girls born in China. That cohort is now entering marrying age of 20 to 24 years old. And the natural sex ratio at birth is 105 boys to 100 girls. So we can see that this problem is only going to accelerate over time. We need to listen to survivors and help them find their voice. So I'm proud that this event today was able to do that. And I, again, extend our appreciation to our partners from Blue Dragon and KWAT for helping us to make these voices heard and allowing us to hear from these incredibly courageous survivors. And it gives me hope that more women will be able to escape, that law enforcement in the countries surrounding China will take this problem seriously and do more to help these women, and that the countries themselves will also support civil society organizations that are working to assist survivors and to prevent these abuses from happening in the first place by making sure that women and girls are aware of the dangers of trafficking and that they have alternatives. So with that, I want to thank everyone again, and I'm ready to, I think, kick off our important discussion with our expert panelists. Is that, Tina, I'm sorry, I know we're a little out of order because of my technological problems today, so I want to make sure I'm doing this right.
You are absolutely right. We are now ready for the panel discussion, and we continue the floor with you to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're really fortunate today to have several leading experts from civil society who are joining us to give us their insights. For our first two panelists, again, you've already seen them. They are from our partners at the Blue Dragon Children's Foundation in Vietnam, Michael Brosowski and Luong Le. Blue Dragon recovers kids from danger and reunites them with their families when possible, providing recovery services. And they're now going to give some brief remarks.
Thank you, Ambassador. I appreciate your introduction. I'd like to start out by giving some background and context to Blue Dragon's work. We started in 2002 as a charity helping street children here in Hanoi, where we're based. We didn't set out to be an anti-trafficking organization, but after some years of our work, we came across cases of trafficking within Vietnam, where children were being trafficked from rural areas to urban areas for sweatshop labor. And so we became involved, and some years after that, one of the young women from our Street Kids program was trafficked to a brothel in China. And so that was how we got involved in this larger issue. Today, we typically deal with cases of Vietnamese girls and women who are deceived and taken into China, believing they're going for work or with a friend, and instead are sold into what we, as a shorthand term, call forced marriages, although they're strictly not speaking marriages. Now, given that today's webinar is being organised by the Strategic Religious Engagement Unit, one question that naturally arises is religion a significant factor in the trafficking of Vietnamese girls and women? Now, the short answer to that is no, but there is some nuance to that. Typically, the victims are targeted because of a vector of vulnerability. And a very common vulnerability is to do with belonging to an ethnic minority group. Vietnam has 53 officially recognized ethnic minority communities, making up 15% of the population, and they are well overrepresented in the trafficking statistics. And each of those 53 groups may have its own religious beliefs. As distinct from an organized religion, they may have their own spiritual or religious beliefs. And they are not the reason that they are targeted for trafficking. But it just happens incidentally that those Vietnamese people being trafficked to China are more likely to hold religious views of a minority group. One thing that we hear in that in the testimony that Luong read a little while ago is that those religious beliefs often buoy or support the victims of trafficking while they're held captive to cope with their situation. And so religion is a factor, but it's not necessarily a cause of the trafficking. And on that note, I'll hand over to Luong to explain a little more about the victims of trafficking that we encounter.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So human trafficking happens everywhere in Vietnam. Anyone can be victims of trafficking, a university student, a single mom, or a high school boy. So 80% of trafficking cases in Vietnam are to be sent abroad, and accounting for 70% are on the borderlines between Vietnam and China to Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and other countries. Yeah, so based on Blue Dragon database, we have worked with more than 1,500 victims so far. So we learned that about 48% of victims are trafficked by their friends, boyfriends, or acquaintances. Yeah, so about 40% of them met their traffickers on social media. The trafficker gained their trust, invite them to hang out or go shopping, then sell them into prostitution or other slavery situations. Though there are some groups who are more vulnerable, they are women and children and people from ethnic minority groups because of poverty, unemployment, and low level of education. So they are easily targeted by traffickers who offer them job opportunities. Yeah. Although there are only 10% of victims learned to get married with foreigners. However, two-thirds of Vietnamese victims are ended up in forced marriage in China. We called it forced marriage. However, there's never husband and wife. Yeah, the women and girls are actually victims of domestic servitude. They are taken to cross the border illegally. They don't have any legal papers, so there are no marriage certificate, no right for those women. They are locked in the house, cut all connections with outside. They are raped by the husband, or sometimes have to serve other men in the family. They are forced to work hard on the farms, in the factory, or as a sex worker to pay back the money that the family had to pay to buy them. So there are many reasons to prevent the victims to be rescued. They are isolated, they cannot make a account for help, they have no money, they don't know the language, and worry about their future at home. So especially when they have a child with the Chinese husband, so they decide that they have to leave for their children in China.
Mm. You can see from Luong's comments the complexity of the situation that these women and girls find themselves in. And I reflect back on what Ambassador Cotton said in his introductory remarks as well, hinting at some of the complexity where the buyers of these women in China may be Chinese men who think that they are paying a marriage broker. They don't realize they're paying a trafficker. And so when these girls and women are free and return to Vietnam, they come back with all layers of trauma to cope with. I think all of us participating in this call can understand the complexity that these women face. So Blue Dragon, as a not-for-profit working in Vietnam, we specialize in providing care for those survivors, and we have a model that's quite comprehensive. We consider ourselves like a one-stop shop for services for trafficking survivors. So we have lawyers on staff who provide legal advocacy and represent trafficking survivors in court when their traffickers are arrested. We have psychologists and social workers. We have shelter, and we facilitate the return of the girls and women to their family homes when that's possible, which it very often is. So there's quite a range of services. And while we do that, while we provide those services, there's the bigger question for us of how do we reduce this phenomenon? How do we reduce the incidence of trafficking? And we've been very fortunate to have funding through the JTIP body of the US State Department up until now, in which we're actually working on a project looking at that question of what interventions work, what can we do that changes the situation, that means less women are trafficked. And we're developing some answers. It's a work in progress, but we are starting to see results from that. We're also separately to that working with the Vietnamese government at the moment on a major revision of the national trafficking law. It's up for its annual 10-year review, and Blue Dragon will take part in that. I would finish by saying we're very fortunate to see strong interest and concern from both the Chinese and the Vietnamese governments on this issue. They're both aware and concerned. And for us, that creates a good condition that we're able to help, able to deliver services, and able to look forward to a time when this phenomenon of the trafficking of girls and women for forced marriages might one day be a thing of the past. So I want to finish on that note of optimism, and I'd like to hand back to you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much for that excellent presentation and for sharing with us about your work. Next, I would love to turn the floor over to our next panelist, who is a Pakistan-based human rights defender, Salim Iqbal. At great risk, Salim has tirelessly advocated for Christian minorities who in Pakistan, who are then also at risk of being trafficked to China. So Salim is going to be giving his remarks in Urdu. So as Tina mentioned, we want to make sure that you are able to understand them. So please make sure you have the interpretation turned on your screen. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Salim. Thank you.
ठीक है, आप अपना
थैंक यू सो मच। मैं समझता हूँ कि ये एक बड़ी अच्छी अपॉर्चुनिटी है और मेरी ये ख्वाहिश भी थी कि मैं किसी प्लेटफॉर्म पे इसके खिलाफ आवाज उठा सकूं, क्योंकि मुझे बहुत ज्यादा दुख होता था जब गरीब घरों की लड़कियों को टारगेट किया जाता था, अनएजुकेटेड जो लड़कियां थी उनको टारगेट किया जाता था। और वजह सिर्फ जो इन शादियों की थी वो ये थी कि गुर्बत की वजह से चाइनीज को यहाँ पर बिजनेस के सिलसिले में आते थे कि हम यहाँ पे बिजनेसमैन हैं, और अब झूठ बोलकर फ्रॉड करके ये बताते थे कि हमारे बहुत बड़े लाभ हैं, हमारा बहुत बड़ा बिजनेस है यहाँ और गरीब घरों।
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for giving me the opportunity to raise this important issue, which has been in the news in Pakistan and has been very difficult for Pakistani Christian girls, especially, and because all these women who were targeted, they were targeted for their status as uneducated Christian women who are living in poor households and come from poor communities and do not have much autonomy in the society to protect themselves.
और यहाँ पर सबसे पहले उन्होंने क्रिश्चियन लड़कियों को टारगेट किया, क्योंकि क्रिश्चियन लड़कियों को इसलिए कि ये वॉइसलेस लोग हैं, मिनॉरिटीज को पहले यहाँ पे हुकूक नहीं मिलते उनके। तो बहुत से यहाँ पे जो हमारे लोग थे उन्होंने भी उनको गाइड किया, चाइनीज को, जो मुस्लिम लोग थे उन्होंने गाइड किया कि क्रिश्चियन लड़कियों को, चूंकि गरीब लोग हैं, इनकी जरूरतें भी हैं, तो इसलिए ये आप इनको टारगेट करेंगे तो ये आपके लिए आसान होगा। और
many of these women were targeted because of their faith, and many of the community leaders, especially the pastors in Pakistan, facilitated the brokering of and price setting of how much money would be paid for each proposal to be given for Chinese men to later pay for.
और यहाँ पर जो है कुछ लोगों को उन्होंने चाइनीज ने एक गैंग बना लिया, जिसमें कुछ पुलिस के लोग थे, कुछ गवर्नमेंट ऑफिशियल्स थे और कुछ जो सो कॉल्ड पास्टर्स थे, उनके साथ मिलकर एक गैंग बनाया। और पास्टर्स जो है वो घरों की निशानदेही करते थे, लड़कियों की निशानदेही करते थे। जिन घरों में लड़कियां जवान होती थी, गरीब होते थे, तो उनको जाकर ये वर्गलाते थे और कहते थे कि आपने अगर अपनी लड़की का रिश्ता करना है तो चाइनीज यहाँ पर बिजनेसमैन आए हैं, वो आपकी बेटियों से शादी भी करेंगे और आपको पैसा भी देंगे।
Okay. Many of these girls who were targeted were coming from obviously poor families, but some of the government officials, along with pastors, who were the first ones to identify which households have young women who are coming from uneducated backgrounds and who could be targeted. The government officials formed rings of trafficking brokers, and along with police, advocates, pastors, all of them were bribed and paid a price to recruit a young female who could be married to a Chinese man. The promises that were made were not just that the man is a Christian man who is from China and is just looking for a wife and will provide a good life in China, but also that the family will be taken care of when the woman is taken to China. And since they come from a poor household, they did not want to turn down these offers, which seemed amazing for them to be taken care of afterwards as well.
और फिर जो यहाँ के सो कॉल्ड पास्टर्स थे उन्होंने इन लड़कियों को टारगेट करना शुरू कर दिया। एक निकाह के एवज उनको 1 लाख से 2 लाख रुपए तक मिल जाते थे, रिश्ता करवाने से निकाह करवाने तक। और फिर उसके बाद कुछ गवर्नमेंट के जो लोग थे उनका आईडी कार्ड बनाने के लिए उनको सपोर्ट करते थे, पासपोर्ट लड़कियों का बनाने के लिए, और शादी के जो सर्टिफिकेट, मैरिज सर्टिफिकेट्स जो नादरा के रजिस्टर्ड होते थे, क्योंकि बाहर जाने के लिए नादरा के सर्टिफिकेट्स रजिस्टर्ड रिक्वायर्ड थे। तो वो सारे जो एक गैंग की सूरत में ऑर्गेनाइज्ड क्राइम जो हो रहा था फेक मैरिजेस का, ये सारे वो लोग शामिल।
It soon turned into an organized crime because the fake marriage certificates were generated, but when we went and checked for the authenticity, Nadra said that the certificates were in fact real. But the fact was that the government officials were being paid, because in Pakistan it's not so easy to just get married to anyone. You need to do a lot of checks, but it was apparently really easy to just pay $600 to the family and around and the Chinese Yes, and the marriages were basically being commenced and completed within the first 10 days of the contact, and the Chinese men took care of the financial burden of the marriages as well. They were not religious, or they were faking their identities as religious people, because in Pakistan religion is a big factor of somebody you would like to marry to. And if the families had known that they do not actually believe in Christianity or are not Christians or coming from the families they promised to, they would have never sent their girls to be married.
और यहाँ पर पहले उन्होंने जो असर लोग थे जिनका इन्फ्लुएंस था, जैसे पुलिस का एक पुलिस ऑफिसर था डीएसपी परवेज भट्ट, उसका बेटा था अंश भट्ट, उसने चाइनीज को अपने चाइनीज के साथ राब्ते किए, और वो फिर चाइनीज का जो मेन गैंगस्टर था जो ये फेक मैरिजेस का सरगना था, उन्होंने मिलकर आधे लोगों को अपने जाल में फेंका, और वो पुलिस के जरिए लोगों को थ्रेट भी करते थे। और अगर कोई लड़की ये इस तरीके से करते थे कि सारी लड़कियों के रिश्ते लेके ना एक ही जगह पे इन्होंने लड़कियों को रखा होता था, 20-30 लड़कियों के ग्रुप को, और फिर वहां पर चाइनीज आते और गाय भैंस बकरियों की तरह उनकी खरीदो फरोख्त करते थे। जिसको जो लड़की पसंद होती थी वो उसी तरीके से उसको करके, तो फिर एक हफ्ते पहले लड़कियों का मेडिकल करवाते थे, फिर मेडिकल करवाने के बाद फिर लड़कियों का निकाह और फिर उनके आईडी कार्ड पासपोर्ट बना के, इसमें गवर्नमेंट के ऑफिशियल्स भी शामिल थे, पास्टर भी शामिल थे, और चाइनीज जो गैंगस्टर थे, ये सारे लोग मिलकर ये काम करते ग्रुप्स की सूरत में।
The girls were kept in groups of 20 to 30 people in one apartment complex, and the Chinese men would then come there and select the wives they would like to take with them to China, and get their passports, all official documents, with the help of government officials involved in the rings, and bring them to China. The lies were then uncovered when the girls arrived and saw their houses, which were completely different than the photos that they were shown. And the girls' mobile phones were snatched. They were beaten, forced to have sex with multiple men. And the men who were in the houses, they were always drinking and beating them and mocked the girls for practicing religion, or the girls were not even allowed to pray anymore. म्यूट पे आप ओके
और फिर ये बहुत सारे ही लोग थे जो ये लड़कियों को फिर बाद में चाइना में स्मगल कर देते थे मिल मिला के सब लोग। और मैंने इस पे, जब मुझे पता चला, मैंने इस पे आवाज उठाई, मैंने सोशल मीडिया के जरिए, अपने टीवी चैनल के जरिए, लेकिन नेशनल मीडिया ने इसमें किसी किस्म का कोई किरदार अदा नहीं किया इस काम को रोकने के लिए। फिर एपी न्यूज से कैथी गैनन ने मेरे साथ रब्ता किया। उसने जब फिर मैंने प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस भी की थी। प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस के बाद मुझे बहुत ज्यादा थ्रेट मिला अंशबाट की तरफ से, कत्ल करने की धमकियां। और जो लड़कियां मेरे साथ शोज करती थी, जो लड़कियां अपने तजर्बात शो बयान करती थी मेरे साथ मिलकर टीवी शोज में, उनको भी कत्ल की धमकियां देना शुरू कर दी कि पाक चीन दोस्ती है। तुम्हें नहीं पता ये पाक चीन दोस्ती तो डिस्ट्रॉय अगर होगी तो तुम्हारा खानदान वो कत्ल कर देंगे, तबाह कर देंगे।
One of the girls who was kept in one of these houses, she contacted me and realized that everything was a bit strange, and it was not that it could unfold and become something else. She just had some skepticism, and I got in contact with her. I tried to uncover the story, but none of the national media was interested back then. I got in touch with a journalist from Canada who broke the story with AP News, and that's how we could draw attention to this, to everything that was happening. Soon afterwards, I started getting threats from government officials. Somebody called Ans Butt, who is at a very high official position in Pakistan, even threatened me on national TV, saying that you are destroying the Pak-China friendship and you don't know the big consequences it could have for you and your family in the coming years.
इसके बाद फिर जब मैंने नेशनल मीडिया पे बड़ी कोशिश की, मैंने कर्जा लेकर जो है 20,000 कर्जा लेकर एक प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस की, मीडिया को कहा कि ये बहुत गलत हो रहा है, फेक मैरिजेस हो रही, क्रिश्चियन लड़कियों को टारगेट किया जा रहा है, इनकी नस्ल कशी की जा रही है, तो आप इसके लिए आवाज बने। तो किसी अखबार ने सिंगल कॉलम खबर नहीं लगाई। लाहौर प्रेस क्लब में मैंने प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस की थी, तो किसी अखबार ने इस काम को रोकने के लिए खबर नहीं लगाई। वो कह रहे थे सी पैक का मंसूबा जो है वो डिस्ट्रॉय हो जाएगा, पाक चीन दोस्ती जो है ये डिस्ट्रॉय हो जाएगी, तो इसलिए आप खामोश हो जाओ, आपको जो एजेंसियां उठा कर ले जाएंगी अगर आपने बात।
I had to get a loan for some money and arrange a press conference by myself to break the news to the media and say that it needs to get attention because Christian girls are especially being targeted. Nobody is coming out to help, and a lot of people are involved in it, and nobody is able to do anything. I was threatened, and I was told that official agencies would come and pick me up, and nobody would even know where I would be even taken, because Chinese gangs as well were involved in it.
चाइना में एक सैड ग्रुप में लड़कियों ने, जितनी 10 लड़कियां थी, उन्होंने एक व्हाट्सएप ग्रुप बनाया था जिसका नाम था सैड ग्रुप। सैड ग्रुप के नाम से उन्होंने मुझे भी ऐड किया। फिर वो बताती थी कि यहाँ पर जो ये हमारे साथ बहुत बुरा सलूक करते हैं, गैर मर्दों को घर में लेके आते हैं, गैर मर्दों के साथ रिलेशन बनाने के लिए कहते हैं, और जो कुछ इन्होंने पाकिस्तान में हमें बताया था यहाँ पर कुछ भी नहीं है, सब कुछ उसके ऑपोजिट है। इनके टूटे फूटे घर हैं, घरों के वॉशरूम नहीं है, जंगलों में रहते हैं और बहुत बुरे हालात हैं। और फिर ये अपनी वीडियो शेयर करते हैं, और फिर ये अगर हम घर जाने के लिए कहते हैं तो यहाँ पे कहते हैं कि बच्चे डिलीवर करके तो तुम चली जाओ। फिर आगे जो है आगे बेच भी देते हैं। ये इस किस्म के तजर्बात है लड़की।
The girls, when they arrived in China, they shared their experience with me in a WhatsApp group chat, which I'm still a part of, and they were sharing that they have been sold off to different men. They are forced to have sex with multiple men, and they would like to come back to Pakistan as soon as possible. But the government did not help. The Chinese authorities did nothing, and later when the news really took off and everybody knew about it. Some girls could come back, whose families could send them money, but there are almost 300 girls that are still there in China, and we have no contact with them. And I'm sure they're in a miserable situation right now.
जी जब एसोसिएट प्रेस ऑफ अमेरिका ने मेरे साथ मिलकर इंटरव्यू किया और उन्होंने आवाज उठाई तो फिर नेशनल मीडिया को शर्म आई और उन्होंने भी खबरें देना शुरू कर दी। फिर पूरी दुनिया में खबरें जो है एसोसिएट प्रेस ऑफ अमेरिका की तरफ से जब चली तो फिर इस पर एक्शन हुआ और फिर वो लड़कियों को उधर से भेजना शुरू कर दिया और पुलिस रिश्वत लेकर भी छोड़ने लगी और लड़कियों को जो इधर पाकिस्तान लड़कियां आना शुरू हो गई। और ये सब मैं समझता हूँ कि ये जो एपी न्यूज एजेंसी है उसकी खुसूसी काविश थी और नेशनल मीडिया की काविश थी, जिसकी वजह से लड़कियां वापस आई। चाइनीज गवर्नमेंट का, पाकिस्तानी गवर्नमेंट का इसमें कोई इंटरेस्ट नहीं था, लेकिन फिर उसके बाद जब पाकिस्तानी गवर्नमेंट ने इंटरेस्ट लिया फिर पुलिस ने पकड़ दकड़ शुरू की और मुलजमान जो पकड़े गए। और फिर लेकिन अफसोस से मुझे कहना पड़ता है कि जब मुलजमान पकड़े गए उनके खिलाफ कोई एक्शन नहीं हुआ। थोड़े दिन उनको जेल में रखा है उन्होंने, फिर जमानतें लेके पर्चा खत्म कर दिया, उनको सजाएं नहीं दी गई।
Many of the men who were arrested during the when the news came out, at first both governments had no interest, neither the Pakistani government nor the Chinese government. But due to the media pressure, the government had to arrest some men. But later on, the men were first arrested, but even the FIRs against them were cleared, and they are not being charged at all anymore. They are free in the society, and it's really sad to see that our justice system does not provide justice to these girls.
उस पे हाँ ठीक है, इसी पे आ रहा हूँ मैं, ठीक है। अब जो लड़कियां वहां यहाँ से आई हैं वो बहुत सी लड़कियां प्रेग्नेंट थी और उनके वालिदैन जो बड़े गरीब थे और बहुत सी लड़कियां जो जिनको मेडिकल की जरूरत थी वो अबॉर्शन करवाना चाह रही थी। वो कह रही थी कि हम बच्चे क्यों पालें इनके, कैसे हम बच्चे सर्वाइव करेंगे। बहुत सी लड़कियों ने बच्चे जो डिलीवर किए और बहुत सी लड़कियों ने अबॉर्शन भी किए। माशरे में उनको इज्जत की निगाह से नहीं देखा जाता था, घरों वाले जो है उनसे जान छुड़वा रहे थे और वो चाह रहे थे उनकी शादियां कर दी जाए। लेकिन हमारी गवर्नमेंट ने, हमारी ह्यूमन राइट के जो मिनिस्टर हैं, इन्होंने किसी किस्म का कोई किरदार नहीं अदा किया। उन लड़कियों के साथ कोई मीटिंग नहीं की, उनकी ट्रॉमा काउंसलिंग नहीं की। उनको ट्रॉमा काउंसलिंग की जरूरत थी, लेकिन इन्होंने किसी किस्म का कोई उनके लिए नहीं किया, बल्कि उनको उनके रहमो करम पे छोड़ दिया। और उसके बाद उनकी 2-2, 3-3 शादियां हुई। पहले से जिन चाइनीज के साथ शादी हुई थी वो भी उनकी भी 5-5, 6-6 शादियां ऑलरेडी हो चुकी थी। तो इस तरीके से मैं चाहता हूं कि इन लड़कियों को बहाल करने के लिए, इनकी बहाली के लिए एक शेल्टर होम की जरूरत है, उनकी एजुकेशन की जरूरत है और उनको मुख्तलिफ स्किल्स जो है वो सिखाने की जरूरत है।
ठीक है। Many of these girls who returned to Pakistan, they were either pregnant or they were about to deliver children and they could not afford or have abortions anymore. And they, in the Pakistani society, they are now shamed for having done such a thing as being trafficked into China, and they live in this image of being dishonored, for being a dishonor for their family and for the society at large. The government did not facilitate any trauma helping schemes for them or any integration programs, and these girls are extremely vulnerable right now because many of them who came back were married by their families to get rid of them, and then later they were divorced and had to marry again. So it's within a year that they had to marry 3 or 4 times with multiple men in Pakistan, and their families want to get rid of them, as well as their in-laws, as soon as they know what has been their history and what has been their past, want to get rid of them. I would like to request that if international community could somehow support the integration of these girls back into society by providing them with counseling, psychosocial counseling, as well as skilled support, which could provide them with some empowerment to be able to live their lives and forget their past in whatever happened with them.
Thank you.
आखिरी क्वेश्चन और उसके बाद मैं सजेस्ट करना चाहूँगा। जी, ओके, थैंक यू सो मच इस अपॉर्चुनिटी के लिए। मैं शुक्रगुजार हूँ और मैं ये क्या
I'd like to thank everyone for this opportunity, and I would like to request all governments that that law should be implemented and enforced, because the men who were left out and are free in the society could target the same women again. There's no action being taken against these girls, and something should be done.
Thank you so much for that powerful and very detailed explanation of the horrific situation that these girls have lived through. It's just terrible. Thank you so much for your work to highlight and uncover this situation. Now I'd like to turn to our final panelist, Professor Mary Graw-Leary, who is joining us from Catholic University and who will talk about the legal challenges associated with bride trafficking. Thank you, Professor Leary.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to everyone who's arranged this really important conversation. It's an honor for me to be here, but it's really an honor to be in the presence of folks like our last three speakers, who are on the front lines doing this important work. And I want to thank the organizers for elevating the voices of survivors. It is so essential in these discussions to have them elevated, because those voices, I honestly believe, as we look at this issue, if people hear these voices, they have a deeper understanding about what we are discussing. So I'm just an academic and I come in at the end. I'm not on the front lines, but I think I'm going to try to sort of put what we've heard in some sense of an international legal context, talk about some of the challenges, and make some suggestions. To do so, I want to offer an allegory. As I prepared for today, I went back 20 years. This is a little bit of an American perspective, but I think many of you working around the world can have your own version of this. And I remembered being a young domestic violence prosecutor sitting in court, and we had a legal structure for dealing with violence. It was called the criminal law. It was called charges like battery, assault, threats. And yet I'd be sitting in court in a domestic violence situation or a child abuse situation, and somehow there was something in the air. Somehow it was different because we were dealing with family members. And these matters, which have no legal significance, were filtering into the process. And I found myself standing in court thinking, oh, I'm not familiar with the he knows her exception or he's married to her exception to the law. And I would suggest to you that that is where we find ourselves today. We have a human trafficking legal framework in the Palermo Protocol, and in
I got a bad connection with her too.
And hundreds of countries who have their own legal structures. And yet, as we've heard today, we're not seeing that legal structure applied.
Is that coming through?
So I'd like to offer some observations about that and sort of try to make a case on how our legal structures in the Palermo Protocol and the push-pull factors that we've heard talked about apply clearly in this case, in these sorts of cases. It was 15 years ago that Kevin Bales talked about Louise Shelley's Ms. Muffet, am I ready to go? I've been cut off. All right, sorry, I keep going? All right, Ambassador, thank you. And he described it in this way. People are pushed out of poor countries where economic opportunity is lacking and pulled into countries with a higher level of prosperity. Well, what we've heard today is if we replace some of those words with marriage, okay, we're seeing the exact same things. In these push factors, we typically talk about a lack of employment or poverty, but as was pointed out by our speakers, oftentimes this happens because of the gender of the potential victims, as well as being part of a religious minority or some other minority. So it has exacerbated their lack of opportunity. Research tells us as well that this is exacerbated in rural, lower educated folks where their advancement is even further limited. And Johns Hopkins did a study of forced marriage into China from Myanmar, and they talked about forced marriage as, quote, a coping strategy for families living in poverty and financial insecurity. In addition to what we've heard today, I just want to add a couple of other things that have emerged from the research. Another factor in this push factor is the concept of bride price, so often found in some countries in which there's a custom to pay the bride's families. Well, that becomes an economic incentive, and understanding we have to be delicate here about customs, but what we're seeing happening is this is compounded when Chinese men are able to offer a much higher bride price. So as we heard from the last speaker, this can become very compelling to the families. Another push factor that we've alluded to, but I think should be underscored, is the idea of corruption. We've heard several examples of where we can find that corruption, government officials, but also there's been lots of discussion about clergy members, or quote unquote clergy members, actually facilitating these matters and being paid significantly to do so, as well as government officials and embassy staff who look the other way when they see these kinds of numbers come through for visas. I think it also, when we think about push factors, should discuss the cultures in which women are devalued and women are passive, and families traditionally make decisions for their marriage. All of that can add to this, these push factors, and put tremendous social pressure on these victim survivors to marry. And one last push factor I want to discuss is this idea of displacement. Again, we've heard about it a lot, but it's worth noting that the UNODC's 2018 global report noted that forced marriage is much more prevalent in high conflict countries. And as Ambassador Richmond pointed out, the TIP report noted that when governments subject religious minorities to forced marriage, that and detention, that detention, that and displacement, that increases this as well. The pull factors Ambassador Eccles-Curry really touched on with the gender imbalance. I just want to add, if I could, to that, some of the research talks about how it's not just seeking women, but these quote unquote husbands have a social pressure to take care of their elders. So the whole family becomes incentivized to find a quote unquote wife to come over to not only produce children, but to take care of the household. And these men are often, those quote unquote husbands are often in rural, poorer communities who don't have the opportunity to obtain a wife in a more traditional way because of this gender imbalance Adding to that, the loose borders, Vietnam and China, apparently you only need a border pass, not a passport. And one thing that hasn't come up yet, but I think is worth mentioning, is the particular vulnerability of North Korean women into China. One thing that the research has availed to us is that the traffickers / husbands will often threaten them with return, which means not only potential death for them, but also for their families. So what a powerful control mechanism that is. Now, I'm sensitive to time, so I was prepared to go through all of the factors in the Palermo Protocol, of which you're all well versed. And I won't do that so that we can get to hear more from our survivors and for frontline workers. But I did want to highlight a couple of things. In terms of convincing the world this is a trafficking problem, sometimes people point to the Palermo Protocol and say, well, forced marriage is not in that list. And I think it's important to point out that the preparatory documentation indicated it was discussed at length. The special rapporteur advised that slavery-like conditions should include this language, and the ultimate decision was to have the Palermo Protocol as it is more open-ended so that we could add these kinds of forms of exploitation as they arise. But there are other international documents that do talk about servile marriage and forced marriage as these forms of exploitation. I just want to touch on two other points, if I could, Ms. Mumford, and you can cut me off if it is time. But one is, when we're all familiar with the action means intention framework. we've talked a lot about marriage and quote unquote husbands. I just want to underscore what we're seeing in forced marriage is marriage used in recruitment, either as used in recruitment, the allure, as we've heard about sometimes, and with the promise of a better life, or what we see is people allured for other reasons and then put into these quote unquote marriages. It's worth noting the Trafficking in Persons report this year discussed how illicit brokers facilitate these marriages of South Asian women into China, with these brokers receiving fees up to $30,000. Last point about religious minorities, if I could, before I throw out some suggestions. We've taught the abuse of power or position of vulnerability in the Palermo Protocol is so essential here. We've talked about the that power differential in a number of ways. I'd just like to add to that when we're talking about child brides or these young women. What we see is in many of these cultures with the bride price, they get a higher price the younger the bride. So there's that incentive there. But the children are that much more vulnerable in that power differential. In terms of where do we go, or what are a couple of challenges and a couple of suggestions as we turn to the panelists. The challenges, of course, there's some of these harmful practices can be disguised in cultural practices, disguise the forced marriage. So really being aware of that. Also, this perception in the air that marriage is a private matter, the government's not wanting to get involved in, and the real power of control over women who are concerned about their children. We haven't heard as much discussion about that, but the research does tell us that the ability of these quote unquote husbands and families to control the destiny of these children is a powerful force for these trafficked women. What are some solutions we can think about? Well, several countries such as Australia and Namibia have included forced marriage in their definition of trafficking to sort of close the door to this debate. Secondly, actually more and more training, as Ambassador Richmond talked about, to identify and to prosecute these cases for what they are, trafficking and not other matters. Also, technology, our last speaker talked about this. The role of technology in recruitment and control is huge here and really hasn't been discussed on an international level. And then I'm lastly really working with NGOs. I've got several examples of some other great work that's going on other than what we've heard of, but I just want to quote the UNODC here. In their study of forced marriages, they had a insightful comment. They said NGOs, in their research, NGOs possessed more information on forced, abusive, and exploitive marriages compared with criminal justice authorities. We really have to incorporate them into the solutions because they are part of the populations at risk, part of the populations that are involved in this, and have the information to assist law enforcement and the trust from the victim community to move forward. Thank you, Ambassador. I hope I made it in time.
Thank you, Professor Leary. As you do know, though, however, we have run a little bit short on time, and I see that Ambassador Brownback has joined us. And so while I would have loved to have a nice time for us to have some Q&A, unfortunately, I think we are not going to be able to do that today. But I do want to extend again my deep appreciation to our panelists for their incredible contributions. I think we've all learned a lot from your presentations today. And I, again, want to commend you for the incredible work that you're doing. I will give you each a couple of minutes. If you have any comments that you wanted to share, I'll start with our friends from Blue Dragon, and then we'll turn it over to Ambassador Brownback, if that's okay with you, Tina.
That's great, thank you.
So some final comments from Blue Dragon. I finished our little presentation just by trying to add a note of optimism, and I do think that cooperation is the key to going forward. I think that the US government has led the world in setting the tone, in placing human trafficking as a priority for every country. And I think that the US therefore is uniquely placed to continue leading this conversation. And I think the challenge for us is how to bring in governments of countries around the world that maybe have less understanding of or less place less significance on the trafficking of persons. But I think it's something that we can do collaboratively as a globe. I'm glad I'm not a politician or diplomat having to work out how to do that. But I remain fiercely optimistic. Would you add anything, Luong?
Yeah, so from our experience, yeah, cooperation not only between countries, but within Vietnam, for example, we are NGO and we work very closely with Vietnam Law Enforcement Agency, not only to rescue support for victims, however, we see the weakness in the law, we see the weakness in their capacity, and we provide support, yes, on the way to all of us want to do is to end human trafficking and support the victims.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting us today.
Of course. Salim, did you have anything any final words that you wanted to add?
Unmute करो अपने आप को.
Thank you so much. इस opportunity के लिए मैं शुक्रगुजार हूँ कि मैं समझी ये मेरी.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I really wanted some action to be taken on trafficking into China, but as well as I would like to highlight the forced marriages, which is a common practice in Pakistan, which actually perpetuate this practice of trafficking to be curbed in Pakistan, because girls coming from minority backgrounds face it the most. And if the US government could do something to tackle that issue, it would, in the long run, also help to stop trafficking.
Thank you, Salim. Professor Leary, did you have any final, or you're good?
How about I quote the Pope? How about that for a final word? That seems appropriate. Pope Francis recently said, we're facing a global phenomenon that exceeds the competencies of any one community or country, and we need mobilization of comparable size to that of this phenomenon. And I think that that's the answer. And I think we've heard from our colleagues, these NGOs working in partnership, that's how we can respond to it.
I think that is a fitting note to transition to my good friend, Ambassador Brownback, to take us home and close us out on this important webinar. But I would be remiss without thanking Ambassador Richmond and the team in JTIP and the team in IRF that brought this wonderful panel to life and brought this event to life today. Thank you so much. And without further ado, my great colleague, Ambassador Sam Brownback, our Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kelly. Appreciate it. Appreciate the panelists.
Sir, your audio and video seem to have paused. Do we have you connected? Ambassador, do we have your audio connected? If you could respond.
Oh, it looks like we've lost Ambassador Brownback, unfortunately. Tina, can I just turn things back to you then?
Sure. I believe he's been having connection issues this morning. Hopefully he will join us back here in just a minute. As we wait for him to reconnect, perhaps I can just give you a bit of background on Ambassador Brownback. As Ambassador Curry said, he is the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. He has had a long career of public service. He served as the governor of Kansas and also represented his state in the House of Representatives and the Senate, where he's actively worked on the issue of religious freedom in multiple countries around the world, and he was a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. Under his tenure as ambassador at large, the department has hosted 2 ministerials to advance religious freedom and worked hand in hand with the government of Poland as it hosted the 3rd just weeks ago. Also, during his time, the department has launched the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, a network among countries all working toward international religious freedom. And in general, the ambassador has just worked tirelessly to fight for the right of everyone, anywhere, anytime, to believe or not believe as their conscience leads. I believe we are still missing the ambassador. Is that correct?
No, I'm
Are you
on.
here?
If you can hear, yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks, Tina. I'm sorry. I've been having a real technical difficulty this morning, so I apologize that having that sort of difficulty. Congratulations on a fabulous program pointing out a specific big problem that exists. And that's the marketing of primarily women and girls, forced brides and concubine type of situations. I've for years have studied and looked at this trafficking issue from a sense of both supply and demand, if you can put it in such crass terms. And unfortunately, there's this huge demand in China because of the one-child policy, primarily. There are other factors too. And there's unfortunately a supply situation, often religious minorities, not exclusively and not because they're religious minorities, but because they're vulnerable. And it's incumbent upon us as the international community to aggressively push back against both ends of this problem, this horrible problem. It was a great honor of my life to be involved in the original human trafficking bill that passed the Congress over 20 years ago. And you could see then these situations lining up. And this is one of the biggest ones in the world. We've got to push on these countries that are not treating their religious minorities appropriately, giving them appropriate guarantees and rights and security. We've got to demand that they be allowed to practice their faith and have the status of a normal citizen in their country. We've got to demand on we've got to push on China to stop this practice of allowing people to be marketed, women to be marketed in these forced servitude situations. We've got to showcase this, and we've got to push to stop this practice and see that it's stopped around the world. So I want to thank you for tuning in to this overall program. I hope it's brought an awareness. I hope it's brought an awareness that brings action and stops this horrific form of human trafficking from continuing in this region of the world. Thank you very much. God bless you all for being a part of it. Thank you, Ambassador Richmond and Ambassador Curry, for working together, all of our offices together to highlight this problem. And let's go do something about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador Brownback. That concludes our event today. I'd like to echo my thanks to Ambassadors Richmond, Curry, and Brownback for their leadership on this issue. We'd also like to thank each of our guest speakers for their insightful remarks, and also Blue Dragon Children's Foundation and Kachin Women's Association Thailand for facilitating such powerful survivor testimonies. There are so many great advocates in organizations like those represented today and others like Human Rights Watch and many, many more who work tirelessly to address these issues, and we commend your ongoing efforts. I want to acknowledge the collective Department of State staff who made today's event possible. Thank you for your hard work. And last, thanks to all of you for joining this important conversation. Wherever you are in the world, I bid you good day and good evening. Thank you.